Quagholio here. I am going to do a presentation here on one of my favorite villains. So, I did a character study and found a bit of how he operates. So, a lot of these things he hasn't ever done in the show. A lot of these expressions. So, I'm going to explain a bit of why I went outside the box here and how it would make sense. So, Rick Prime, he is very broken and not happy. But there's no evidence that would be obvious unless someone were to go in a microscopic detail and understand where certain behaviors come from. One of the great signs, I'm just going to start simple here on evidence. A racing family, he frowned. He wasn't crying, but he frowned when he showed him when he went and erased Slow Mobius. That is a characteristic of self-loathing or self-hatred. He pretty much hurt himself to hurt all of himself. He did that on purpose. It's actually where I saw that a very important detail, because it isn't just like with saying the word ego. That is too shallow. It can mean it can be an entire textbook of information behind just one word, because that's how complex it is. So this was a piece of evidence big enough for me to find that he is treating himself badly. That would mean he doesn't see himself as a god truly, like he has a low self-worth, which is similar to how the other Ricks would do alcohol and all these things. Like, this was a lack of respect for himself. So we're going to look a bit deeper here. Even though he may seem a bit shallow, bored, so literally he is in a state of isolation. He isolated himself in a chamber and he erased Diane, and then he's away from all of his family, and he doesn't believe that anything has a purpose, which is called nihilism. And with this belief, that is why he is struggling to slap a purpose on, because this is too much on a person's conscience to think there is no purpose for anything. So he decided to be a god as his own purpose. But that actually does counteract this idea. It is a contradiction. And that can be psychologically distressing, because when he thinks there is no purpose and then he then gravitates towards this, that means he's not okay with this. He actually, this is one of the most fascinating things, because he actually may be a perfect character for development, because of how far he went into this. Is like he really wanted there to be something, so he clung on to that. It's too painful to think that nothing had a purpose. So actually he has the perfect recipe here to possibly be a different character, at least to if something were to change him. But that would only be if he had the right situation. Now I'm going to go into more of the complex of how he could possibly make a turn to be a protagonist. And first, I must explain a bit of his ego foundation. So, every ego has a foundation. That is like building a house. And Rick Prime maintains his house by severing connections to family and to himself. And then he also isolates himself. And that really does reveal a bit more of just how vulnerable he is. So this foundation is only there to not come across any situation or circumstance to be seen as weak, or to at least see himself. It's more on seeing himself as weak. And this is why a foundation is ever built. It's because of how painful it can feel to them to feel weak. And usually villains are very determined to guard their soft part of them, the most splintered area. So ego is going to be kind of like fitting oneself into a shoe that doesn't fit. There you go. So maybe I can make it into more of like a boot of his. So he's always trying to fit himself into not seeing his weakness. This is his way to even guard his own mind from wandering that direction. He's always going to be like exercising the idea of being like a god. It's an exercise. This is why like he could be repeating himself and also just be in the castle all the time that he's created. That is his foundation. It's also is pretty much the foundation is mainly external. That's why he is physically unpresent everywhere, to not be around anyone or anything. Doesn't want anything to reflect his own weakness. It's mainly on the reflection of that. He doesn't want to see himself, and that is also a characteristic of self-loathing. He's pretty much trying to sever any type of conscious view, or at least a conscience of where he's at, because the conscience is going to show the vulnerabilities, is going to show the wounds, and he doesn't want to see those wounds. And that is why usually villains don't take that knowledge pretty well. They usually, I want to say it's because they're overreacting. It's actually a way that they pull back from a painful touch, because whenever their wounds are exposed, their weakness is exposed in them, if they feel like their entire reality is being threatened because they built it. They build their reality, and Rick Prime built his. And if he were to at all come across any scenario that were to draw his reality from under his feet, is gonna crush his foundation really bad. And villains, a lot of villains end up dying from this process. That's why a lot of villains die in like Disney films or a lot of movies, because usually they cling onto it until the bitter end. And a prediction being, yes, Rick Prime, there's a lot of different pathways his character could take, and he didn't have any opportunity, no moment in the show where he at all reacted to anyone touching his ego. So he had the easy way out to die, actually. Then that's not good for character development. That ends it. It would just be the end. And that's why his death wasn't an ugly, bitter reaction. And usually it's extremely painful for a villain to see just how ugly and vulnerable their insides are. They're going to see the ugliness and they want to cover themselves. And that's why I have looked deep into Rick Prime to realize that. And I predicted that if he was in a situation, it's going to unravel, or it's going to bring into surface, his personality would erupt. He's going to show how fearful he actually is, and he's going to have an unstable amount of anger. This is the insecure foundation. And both of these usually surface at the same time. So that's why villains usually freak out. They might completely be in full on panic mode. It's like a cornered animal type of behavior. And it's probably a better way to usually it's not easy to turn a villain around, because most of them go down with their foundation. They don't ever come back. And that is a fascinating thing. But if we see a different routing, if he is somehow clinging on it, if he had the glimmer of goodness left, or usually villains do have a glimmer of goodness in them. A lot of villains do. It is that perhaps they might end themselves a bit too early, or they might be killed off too early for that to even surface, because they usually can't make it past this part. But if he made it past this part and not escape or be killed before his foundation crumbles completely, he then goes through the character. He would go through the character process of then rebuilding, but there is always a possibility they might cling on to another cycle of ego, but it's also a huge possibility for a character to cling on to a better purpose, which is a stabler type of foundation, way more stable actually, because if it's a solid purpose that isn't slapped on, it's going to be more of a physical, real object there, as if he has it in his fist. It's not something that's just an empty idea anymore, which that was what he was clinging on to, an empty idea. And so I also looked into how his foundation really is to, or even though I was talking all about it here, if there was to be a toxic prime, it would be extremely interesting because he would take all of his ego with him. So if he went into the toxifier, he sees himself as the literally the way he would want to be. So toxic prime would be empty. So this actually makes him humble because he's not clinging on to any of what he thought or what Rick Prime would think is what he needs to be perfect. He's already very convinced that he's perfect, and Toxic Prime would not be that